Well, shalom, y'all. I want to bring you to a close reading of Isaiah 7. Now, I'm going to use a specific format in this reading that matches a class I'm teaching on Isaiah with the things that I'm looking for, things I'm going to be talking about for the class. But I also think it's a good way to look at interpreting a passage from Isaiah, understanding the passage, and then applying the passage. So hopefully it will be of use to everyone. Let me know if it's not, and we'll try to change it. So, today we're going to talk about a close reading. Again, this is what I require in my class, but hopefully looking at the text in detail is a good thing that everyone should do. And I'm going to be taking the whole chapter of Isaiah 7 just to give me some room to play with some options. But if one of my students were doing this, I would recommend that they shorten the passage down and use the literary markers, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to find a shorter passage that they could really hone in and focus in more detail. Taking chapter 7, you could probably write an entire book about Isaiah 7, but we're not going to do that today. We're going to be relatively brief. But what I'd like to do is start with a summary slide to sort of get everything out there in the beginning to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. And this is what I would require of the students, is a summary to let me know what their paper is going to be about. So the first thing we need to think about anytime we're dealing in Isaiah is the historical context. What's going on in the surrounding areas? And I have a whole video on this in the Isaiah playlist. If you want to watch it, you can. I think the historical context is very important here because there are lots of weird names and things in this chapter. And if you understand the geography, if you understand the historical context, the names start making more sense. If I were to summarize in just a few seconds, what I would say is Judah, the southern territory, is surrounded by enemies. Israel is an enemy. Syria is an enemy just to the north. Assyria is an enemy to the way northeast. And Judah is literally about to lose its life as a nation. And they are desperate to know who to trust. Do they trust God? Do they make alliances? And the king actually makes an alliance with an Assyrian king to defend himself against Israel and Syria. So the king is making bad decisions here. We can see the parallels in Chronicles and Kings if you want to go get the detail behind it. But that's the short message. Judah is desperate and they want to know who to trust. Do they trust God or do they trust somebody else? And that's the historical context now. Judah's in trouble. Who do you trust? Second thing we need to look at is the literary context. Isaiah is an assembled book. It's the works of maybe 60 years of his sermons and prophecies, and someone has put it together so that they had to decide what sequence to put it together in. So I'm convinced that sequence is important in Isaiah. And we see something here in chapter 7 that is a little bit different than what we've seen before. Before now, they've all been visions. There have been judgment visions. There have been woe oracles, there have been heavenly throne room visions. But here in chapter 7, we start seeing a passage of narrative. So this is a new kind of genre, which means it has new rules of interpretation. And I'll go into that in some more detail later. So the other thing, once we have a narrative established, we want to see what are the literary markers? Where does this passage start and where did this passage end? Now, in this case, the chapter division is pretty good because chapter 7 starts off with talking about it came about in the days of King Ahaz, a clear difference than what was happening in chapter 6. Then in chapter 8, we get, then the Lord said to me, so we get another clear break. So clearly, chapter 7 is set off fairly well. Now, there's some divisions in chapter 7, but the literary markers are then in the day, and then the Lord said. So it's two indications that the subject changes, and then in chapter 8, the subject changes again. When we look at the poetic elements, even though it's narrative, there are images in here. The She'ar Jashub, and no one really knows how to pronounce that name, but means something. A remnant will return, so there's a symbol there. The name Emmanuel means something. There is a symbol there. So these names are going to be important to us. The idea of eating curds and honey is also going to be important to us. And this is a little more subtle, but the last part of chapter 7, 17, 18, and following talks about in that day. And if you're more familiar with the Old Testament, you'll recognize that is sort of a code word for the end times, when God returns to make everything right. When you see that in that day, don't think about something that's going to happen necessarily immediately. Think about something that God is going to do when He fulfills all prophecy. So those are some important images and poetry that's going on. Themes we see here are certainly the sovereignty of God. God is in control. The presence of God. God is with the people, even though they're surrounded and they're in trouble and they don't know who to go to and they may not be seeing God because they're worshiping foreign idols and stuff. God is with them. Final theme in this passage is a remnant. God will rescue, restore, and redeem a remnant. Now, God will judge because God is faithful. Now, God is faithful. That's good news. It means He's going to fulfill all His promises, but it also means God is going to judge sin. God has to judge sin. And God will redeem the remnant, the faithful remnant. So there are a lot of themes going on here, but they're all revolved around God judging and God rescuing and restoring. And we'll see this play out in the chapter too. Old Testament parallels, you can go back to, I think it's 2 Kings 16 and 2 Chronicles 28 to get the detailed history about what's going on here. And that's always a good idea. Anytime you're reading the prophets, is go back to Chronicles and Kings and see what's going on because it gives you the background. Now, New Testament parallels, there are actually a fair number of them. Matthew 1:23 is the Emmanuel passage. Everybody knows about that. But this idea of God is with us, we see all through the New Testament. One of the examples is in Mark 4, where Jesus is in the boat with His disciples during the storm. The disciples are running around crazy, they think the boat's going to sink, they're going to die, and they wake up Jesus, and Jesus goes, what are you worried about? I'm here with you. And they don't understand that in the midst of the trouble, Jesus is there with them. God, literally the presence of God is there with them and will protect them. And of course, that's the scene where Jesus quiets the water. A little more subtle, but we see this in Revelation too. In Revelation 1, I think it's verse 12, you see Jesus among the 7 lampstands, which are the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. Now, the churches in Revelation are suffering terrible persecution, even unto death. And they're wondering, where is God? What's God going to do? You know, things are really bad. Coronavirus is running crazy. I don't know where that slipped into Isaiah, but people are in trouble. And they're looking for God, and God is right there in their midst. If they only remain faithful, they will see God and they will be protected. So there's that strong presence of God all through the New Testament. Let's see, the last thing is the literary context. What is going on here, okay? Why do we see this narrative? I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The application, I think, is pretty clear. It's when you're in trouble, who do you trust? Even when you don't see how there is any way out, you still should trust God. And I think the real application is, if I believe that God is faithful, if I believe God will deliver me, how will I lead my life today? When I'm on my way to the grocery store or wherever it is I'm going, what will I do different if I know that I can depend on God? And I think that's a powerful idea that will work out in a lot of different ways in a lot of people's lives. So I think that's the application. If I really know that I can depend and trust on God, how will I live differently? What steps of courage will I take? What kind of leaps off the cliff will I take if I know that God will support me? So that's the application. Now let's look at it in a little bit more detail. The historical context, like I said, I have a video for that, or even maybe a couple of videos. I'd recommend going through those because it shows you on a map what's going on and it clarifies some of the names. But the point is, Judah is surrounded by enemies and they want to know who they can trust. Now, King Ahaz in this example makes some bad decisions. He decides not to trust God and he suffers the consequences. So that this is sort of a good, bad example in the Old Testament. This king is desperate, but he refuses God. He refuses God's offer of a sign and kind of piety, and then he refuses to follow God even after God has given him a sign. So let's look at the literary context in a little more detail. This is the first narrative passage after a bunch of visions. And you have to kind of say, why would Isaiah do that? Or whoever is assembling this, why would they do that? And I think what he's saying is he's giving some real life examples to people. He's given them a lot of visions and saying, I see all these images and all these things are going to happen. But now he's saying, let me give you something concrete. Let's cut to brass tacks here, and I can prove to you that what I am saying is accurate. So, and we also have to keep in mind here that Isaiah, as we read it, is speaking to multiple audiences. And I'll tell you what I mean. Isaiah originally prophesied this to the people who were going through this, the people who were surrounded by enemies. So that was the original audience. But once it's written down, the written audience becomes important too. And the written audience, it lives some period of time. I don't know exactly how long, but some period of time after Isaiah finished. So when they read Isaiah, they are reading it from the perspective of history. They know what happened to the original generation that Isaiah was talking to, that original audience. The original audience, for the scope of 2 years, won't know what happened, because Isaiah says it'll take a couple of years for you to know this is going to happen. But during that 2 years, they still have to remain faithful. But after that point, people know that everything that Isaiah said came true. The kings were destroyed. The virgin had a child. They were looking at a time of prosperity. So they are getting this with just a little bit different perspective. So we always have to keep this in mind, that the reading audience knows, so the prophecy of Isaiah is proven for them. They remember, or their grandchildren remember, or their children remember what happened. Now, of course, they ignored it again, and I think there's a lesson for us today. We also have a perspective of history. We can look at the narrative and we can say, yep, historically we know all these things happened. Isaiah was right. But then we don't follow what he says. We don't repent and return. We don't remember to do what Isaiah tells us to do in a message from God. So I think we can't be too hard on the people, but we do have to remember that they're looking at it from different perspectives. So what's going on here? I think the point is that God is always in control. Isaiah is using this narrative passage to continue his lesson. God is judging, but God is always in control. God is always with us. God will always remain faithful. Remember, that's a two-edged sword. God will judge, and God will rescue, redeem, and restore the remnant. If you can trust one, you can trust the other, so you know it's going to happen. Also, a little bit interesting thing going on here. This narrative passage in Isaiah 7 and 8 is sort of mirrored by a narrative passage in Isaiah 36 through 39. And excuse me, I'm not quite smart enough to figure out exactly what's going on here, but I'm sure it must be significant that sort of the first part of the book has a narrative passage that introduces the following concepts, and the second part of the book has a narrative passage that introduces the following concepts. So I think again, whoever assembled this, Isaiah or a scribe, did that on purpose to kind of give us a marker to say, okay, here's the setting, here's what's coming on in the next few chapters. Pay attention to this. So we talked about the literary markers of when this passage started. 7:1, clearly a change of subject. Now it came about in the day of Ahaz. Chapter 8, then the Lord said to me, totally different subject, different scene, different everything. So chapter 7 is one particular passage. But now inside chapter 7, I would direct you to some specific literary markers, and if you're looking for a smaller passage to examine, these would be good literary markers to kind of pick up, to use to identify your passage, a smaller passage. So Isaiah 1 through 3 is just sort of some history, it's background. But then you notice in Isaiah 1 through 2, history and background. Isaiah 3, then you notice the word then. So it's indicating that something new is happening, a little bit of a change of subject. Then. So we see in Isaiah 2, verse 3, a then. Verse 10, we see another then. So I would argue that 3 through 9 is a segment, and using those thens as literary markers to pick up on what the segment is. Another segment starts in verse 10, and it ends, 17 or 18, when you see in that day. Again, a very clear marker that something has changed. The time frame has changed here. Isaiah is talking about something that's going to happen in the future, not something that is a then. So if you're looking for individual passages, I would use those markers to pick out those passages and just really focus in on what's going on in their passages. Now, the genre and the poetry. This is narrative. Narrative is accurate. Narrative has historical details. Narrative is meant to be taken literally. Now remember, that doesn't mean you can't use poetry inside of narrative, and the poetry has to be interpreted. The children's names or Emmanuel's names or something like that. But when you're talking about historical details, we're supposed to take these details seriously. And many of the details we can confirm from history that we have recorded throughout the ages. So we can say, yep, that happened. Tiglath-Pileser III really was the king. And we can pull all these historical details down. Can't confirm everything, but the fact that we can confirm a lot of them gives us some confidence that the ones we can confirm are probably also accurate. So you got a lot of confirmation. If the author was accurate in the details we can confirm, pretty good chance the author is going to be accurate in the details we can't confirm yet. And I think it's interesting, as we do more archaeology, we see more justification and more verification of what we had in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Things we couldn't verify in the past, we can verify now. So these are real life situations. These are things that are taking place in history. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. But I want us to be a little bit careful here, because when we read prophecy in the Old Testament, prophecy can have multiple fulfillments. Now, Isaiah is talking about a virgin giving birth, or a young woman giving birth, depending on how you want to translate it. But in the context of the time, a young woman would have been a virgin. And that prophecy to be valid has to be fulfilled. For that prophecy to be good, for the king to know that God is with him, that prophecy actually has to be fulfilled. So I think there is an immediate fulfillment of this prophecy. However, from a New Testament perspective, we see a future fulfillment of this prophecy. That's the passage from Matthew. Matthew, a very Hebrew kind of gospel. He goes back and says, remember what Isaiah said about Emmanuel, God is with us? Well, that was true, but here is the real fulfillment. God is with us in the person of Jesus. So very often we see sort of an initial fulfillment, and then in New Testament times, a complete fulfillment of the prophecy. So don't get hung up and say, well, the prophecy's not fulfilled until Jesus' time. I think it's fulfilled in Isaiah's time. It had to be of use to the king, but that doesn't mean that it can't work for us today too, and clearly it does in the person of Jesus. Let's look at the poetry, this She'ar Jashub. And I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, but that's my best guess based on what I know about Hebrew. A remnant shall return. The point of the name is not how you pronounce it, what it means. And Isaiah has named his child this as a sign to Israel, to say, yes, judgment is coming. Yes, there is no way to avoid it, and you're going to leave the country, Israel and Judah. You're going to leave, you're going to be driven out, but a remnant shall return. It's a clear indication of God's judgment, but also God's mercy. And we see this sort of dual thing all the way through Isaiah. We see a woe oracle or a judgment oracle. And then after that, we'll see a messianic passage, or a suffering servant passage, or a restoration passage. So Isaiah is not all doom and gloom for the world. It's mixing in God's real character. There is judgment, but there is rescue and redemption for a remnant. And that's kind of the author is playing off that son's name. Now, it also applies in the next chapter, where it's swift is the booty, speedy is the prey. That indicates that somebody's going to be running from something pretty soon. So again, judgment and restoration. But I think it's important that we do know that these are the images we see. Second image, or the name we see, is Emmanuel. God is with us. And this is the passage we're all familiar with as New Testament Christians. But the point is, God is with us. Even when we don't behave right, even when we're overwhelmed by trouble, God is with us. All we have to do is sort of open our eyes and open ourselves to the presence of God. And God is there waiting for us. He was waiting for Judah to depend on them, to rescue them. God is waiting for us today to depend on Him to rescue us. He's always here. He's always around. We just need to open our eyes. And I think the passage in Mark 4, the storm in the Sea of Galilee, is a great example of that. Revelation 1:12 might even be a better example. People are being killed in the 7 churches in some places, and they're going, where is Jesus? Where is God to rescue us from that? And Jesus is in the midst of the churches. They can't see Him. It's in the dark, but their lights are there, and He is there once we open our eyes, once we see what's going on. Now, a little nit that I always find fascinating, and it involves translation. Emmanuel is very often translated, God is with us. But whoever translates the Bible does not always translate that Hebrew phrase, Emmanuel. And I think sometimes it depends if they think it's a name or not. But Emmanuel shows up sometimes when it's not translated as Emmanuel. And I'll give you some examples. Look at chapter 8, verse 8. Then it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through. It will even reach to the neck, and the spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Now that doesn't sound like whoever was born to, Isaiah's virgin. It sounds like somebody different. Of course, from a New Testament perspective, we would see that as Jesus. But they have translated that there clearly as a name. Now, if you look down at same chapter, verse 10, devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us. But literally in the Hebrew, that for God is with us is Emmanuel. So the authors have chosen to translate that name rather than using the Hebrew Emmanuel there. So I think you have to be a little bit careful when you're reading through the Bible is to, if you can, do a little work with the Hebrew, get a Strong's Concordance or something, and see how these names are treated, if they're translated or not, and if they are, what impact that has on the translation. If you say state a proposal, but it will not stand, Emmanuel, what does that mean? And again, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to answer that, but it's something in the text that I noticed, and I think it's important that we ask that question and strive for an answer. Two other things we see here is the idea of curds and honey. And the only time normal people could eat curds and honey were in times of prosperity. So this is, Isaiah could just say, good times are coming, but he uses sort of that poetic image that everybody knows refers to good times. So think about how that might apply to modern times. I don't know exactly, a COVID virus and lots of money or something. But whatever it is, it indicates to us that prosperity is here, safety is here, people can relax. So Isaiah is saying, trust God. God is going to give you a sign, and you will know in a very short period of time that all these things are going to come to pass and that you can trust God. Of course, the people decided not to anyhow, so that there may be a message there for us today. Last thing is that we see in verse 17, but certainly in verse 18, in that day. And again, that's an indication of the end times. So this is when Jesus comes back. So, we see Emmanuel in the Old Testament, God is with us. We see Emmanuel in the New Testament in Matthew, Jesus is with us. But we also see Emmanuel in the book of Revelation where Jesus comes back. And he comes back to judge everyone and set things to right with a new creation. So this is one continuing story. And I'm convinced that John uses that concept for two reasons in the book of Revelation. One is it's right and it's accurate and it's true, but he's also pulling these references from Isaiah. Just like when Paul talks about the Isaiah passages, he's using the Hebraic background that everyone was familiar with. John is doing the same thing. So he's pulling this in and he's saying, yep, you're all familiar with this, but let me tell you how it really works out. And then he goes through the book of Isaiah to do it. So themes in the book, the sovereignty of God. God is in control. And I think it subtly shows up, but if you go back to the beginning of chapter 6, it talks about the year of King Uzziah's death. And then we get this throne room experience, which is weird and wonderful, and again, paralleled in Revelation. But to me, one of the interesting things is the king is dead. That's a time period of fear and uncertainty. What's going to happen? Is the new king going to raise taxes? Is the new king going to sell us out? Oh, woe is me. Okay, now, we're not going through anything like that right now. I know everybody is comfortable. But we worry during transitions. It's an election year right now, and you can't hardly read anything without it saying, if one candidate is elected, it's the end of the world. If the other candidate is elected, it's the end of the world. If neither candidate is elected, it really will be the end of the world. Kings change, presidents change, things change. But notice what happens exactly after Isaiah says the king is dead. He sees God sitting on his throne. Kings come and go, but God is always on his throne. If we're trusting God, we don't have to worry about trusting a king. We don't have to worry about trusting anything earthly because God is always on his throne. His power fills his throne room, and he is always in control. So we get this enormous vision in chapter 6 about God's throne room and God in control and God purifying people, and God is just doing it. And we see in chapter 7, God saying, give me a shot. Let me do something so that you can know. I will prove that your faith is good, that your faith is validated. And God reaches out to us so much to say, I'm in control, you can trust me. Okay? And again, the people have to decide whether to believe or not. But sovereignty of God is huge in the book of Isaiah. Now, that's good news, because if God is in control and God has promised something, it will happen. If God made a promise in the Old Testament, it's going to happen. God made a promise in the New Testament, it's going to happen. Those are called covenants sometimes, okay? We can depend on those. Now, the bad news is God has promised to judge sin. From an Old Testament perspective, the people in Israel and Judah are doomed. There is no rescue. They have ignored the prophets. They've ignored God for so many hundreds of years. Judgment is coming. But the other part of that is, part of God being faithful, is God will provide a way for the remnant. Now, from an Old Testament perspective, it was the Hebrews that came back from exile. From a New Testament perspective, it's anyone who accepts salvation through Jesus Christ. Okay? That's the remnant. Those are the ones who will be delivered and redeemed and restored. And when we talk about in that day, the book of Revelation, the end times, it's a new creation, a new heaven, and a new earth that is prepared for those who are saved. So it's one long story. God will judge his people, but God will deliver his people. And that's no different from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Everybody knows John 3:16, for God so loved the world, and following. But you need to also read John 3:17 and 3:18, where it says that anybody who rejects Jesus has already judged themselves. So we take the responsibility of judgment on us when we reject Jesus. When we do that, we are choosing to go to hell. We are choosing to be judged by God and not have a Redeemer. So I think that this idea of God's judging is not just an Old Testament passage or concept, it's a New Testament concept too. And just like the grace of God is just not a New Testament concept, we see it as an Old Testament concept too. And in the last half of Isaiah 7 is all about that redemption and the restoration. Finally, there's a remnant. God is going to rescue, redeem, and restore the remnant. Now, again, good news, bad news. The bad news is the remnant's a remnant. It's a small part. Most of the people have rejected God for hundreds of years, and they will suffer punishment. They will die, or they will lose their home, or whatever. They're gone. But a remnant will remain. And I think this is important to us today is, as Christians in a world that is increasingly non-Christian, is we have to remember that concept goes on. We are strangers in a strange land, some people have said. And we have to remember that if we are Christians, if we are saved, we are the remnant. Not everyone will be saved. And again, we see this concept all the way through the book of Revelation. And I'll paraphrase here now, but at the end of Revelation 9, we see people that know the world is ending, that know that God is judging, and yet Revelation says they continued in their sin because they would rather be sinners than accept God, repent and accept God. So this idea of the remnant is always going to be with us. It's sad, it's heartbreaking, but most people, I guess, are always going to reject God. So we see it in Isaiah, we see it in the New Testament, and we see it in the book of Revelation. So there's a remnant. They will be restored, and the ultimate restoration is the new creation we see in the book of Revelation, Revelation 21, where God creates a new heaven and a new earth. Everything is new bodies. We're all resurrected, and that will be our creation for eternity with God. Now, we've talked about the Old Testament, New Testament parallels. Go back to Chronicles and Kings, read the history. We talked about Matthew 1:4, Emmanuel, the birth of Jesus. We talked about Mark 4, and we probably talked about Revelation way more than you want to. But understand that what we're seeing here in Isaiah, the themes carry over, the concepts carry over the entire Bible. Finally, so what? What does this mean to us? Well, God is in control, and God is faithful. We see that here. And God will talk to us. God will let us know what He's going to do. And if we really believe that, it ought to have an impact on our lives. If God is always on our throne, it doesn't really matter who the president is. And I know it does from an earthly perspective, but Who are we depending on for security? God or the president? God or the government? Governments change, God never does. And I think the lesson for Isaiah is, I need to depend on God because God is Emmanuel. God is with us. Jesus is with us. And how does that work out? When I go to the grocery store today, how do I treat people differently? How do I drive differently? How do I pay my bills differently? What do I do in my life if I am convinced that God is my security and it's not necessarily the government or Social Security or insurance or a big bank account or flashy clothes or whatever? If I really believe God is my security, how will I live differently? And I think that's the question everyone has to ask themselves and answer themselves individually and work it out in their daily lives. So thanks, guys. Appreciate you taking the time to listen to a close reading of Isaiah 7. And until next time, shalom, y'all.